My grandfather and his family fled Germany when he was a child, fled the Nazis. That's my maternal grandfather.
That's Joseph Howley. He's an associate professor of classics at Columbia University.
My paternal grandfather, I have a copy here on my desk of his FBI file. He's just this guy from Newcastle, Pennsylvania. I think he's a meteorologist or something for the Army. He was deployed to Great Britain about the end of the war. And he spends his weekends going into London, consuming culture. He starts hanging out at this leftist or anarchist bookstore where the British domestic intelligence services are, of course, monitoring everyone who hangs out. They clock that an American serviceman is in this, den of subversion. They send a report to the U.S. military. It gets filed. The war ends. He comes home. He's working for the Postal Service. All of a sudden, federal law requires that all federal employees be investigated for possible communist ties. They start sending FBI agents to Newcastle, Pennsylvania, where he lives, and basically interviewing everyone looking for some trace of communist sympathy. There's actually a letter in the file where he writes personally to Hoover and says basically, if you think I'm a communist, would you please just come and ask me? Because this is getting really annoying. I think I have the letter here. Do you want me to read it to you?
Yes, please.
This letter is dated April 12th, 1948. Dear Mr. Hoover.
Of course, it's not just annoying. It's also threatening his livelihood.
I plan to reside in this community and am currently projecting a business venture which will need to have the goodwill and respect of the community.
Hoover never writes back.
This basically makes life kind of unbearable for him, and he ends up moving out of town. And this is all on nothing. It's all on the basis of nothing.
Today, when Joe is on campus, it looks to him like that history is repeating itself.
This moment recalls the McCarthyist moment more and more every day.
Was there an accelerated process that was put into place for Mahmoud Khalil because he was trained as a professional agitator and organizer? Yeah. Was there any suspicion acceleration by the Biden State Department?
And it's so blatant.
Flyers with the logo of Hamas. That is what the behavior and activity that this individual engaged in. And I have those flyers on my desk. They were provided to me by the Department of Homeland Security. I thought about bringing them into this briefing room to share with all of you, but I didn't think it was worth the dignity of this room.
And it's so shameless.
How did he support Hamas? Exactly what did he do?
Well, I think you could see it on TV, right? It's this is somebody that we've invited and allowed the student to come into the country, and he's put himself in the middle of the process of basically pro-Palestinian activity.
I think those of us who know a little history can see it very obviously.
Joe knows Mahmoud Khalil well.
I really got to know him after the first Gaza Solidarity encampment went up.
He says he didn't get the impression that Mahmoud was calling the shots.
There were times when he was trying to interface with the administration, and they maybe felt like they were getting somewhere, but the encampment said, no, this is not acceptable to us.
Joe says Mahmoud was more of a diplomat, a spokesperson, yes, but somebody trying to find a solution that worked for everyone.
Everyone here knows him as like a communicator, mediator, a spokesperson. He's the kind of person you want on hand when things are getting hot.
After he was arrested, Mahmoud was moved to New Jersey, then to a detention center in Louisiana, where he still sits today. He hasn't been charged with a crime, and his lawyers say that government filings for his removal haven't even argued that he's a national security threat. Instead, the feds are using a provision from the Immigration and Nationality Act that says that anyone can be deported if their views and activities run counter to U.S. foreign policy. And wielding that provision is up to the U.S. Secretary of State.
This is not about free speech. This is about people that don't have a right to be in the United States to begin with. No one has a right to a student visa. No one has a right to a green card, by the way.
Today on Things That Go Boom.
No, you can't deport my hecking Mahmoud Reno. What about the First Amendment or something?
Ice, ice, baby. Dun, 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 dun.
I'm for deplatforming too. I want certain people deplatformed from my country.
The new McCarthyism. What this campaign to suppress pro-Palestinian activism means for the far right, and why Trump is starting with Palestine. I'm Lacey Healy.
Hi, I'm Kate Laycock, host of DW's weekly European news podcast, Inside Europe. Our correspondents were there when the Berlin Wall fell, when the Balkans Wars broke out, and when Britain voted to leave the European Union. Now the continent is changing again, and we're rising to the challenge with our weekly combination of expert analysis and on-the-ground reporting. Find Inside Europe wherever you get your podcasts.
Things That Go Boom is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with AutoQuote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
We begin tonight with that breaking news, a horrific scene in Charlottesville, Virginia.
A car plowing through counter-protesters down this crowded street, protesters scrambling, the camera swinging wildly as the man taking this video tries to get out of the way.
The car just plowed through.
All I saw were people flying away, and then I saw a car.
The car was driven apparently deliberately into a group of protesters.
And then I looked to my left, and I saw Heather Heyer lying on the ground.
I got back from that rally and my editor at the time was like, okay, you're covering the far right, you're covering extremism from now on. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
Back in 2017, when white supremacist marchers hit the streets of Charlottesville, journalist Chris Mathias was there working for the Huffington Post. Up to that point, Chris had mostly been covering Islamophobia in Trump's first campaign.
And then that kind of naturally segued into covering the far right. And I just finished writing my first book, which is called To Catch a Fascist, which is about anti-fascist work to unmask and expose secret white supremacists.
Chris says that one of the things that struck him when he was writing his book is that historically there's this fine line between pranks and reality.
The Klan, was started by essentially some frat bros in Tennessee who were former Confederates, fought in the war. And initially what they started doing was pulling what they called, pranks, like harmless pranks. They were tricksters. Basically, they would pretend to be ghouls or ghosts and pull up to black people's homes in the middle of the night and scare them. Of course, that quickly turned into a campaign of absolute terror where the Klan was riding around the South and, murdering and burning and torturing.
Chris sees parallels between that 20th century history and the frog memes, Hawaiian shirts, and OK symbols that led up to 2017.
The alt-right, when it first started out, was drenched in this irony and humor, and it gave them a kind of in-group language they could use to simultaneously disguise what they were saying, but also, hopefully, from their perspective, get those ideas to a point where they wouldn't have to be disguised at all.
We memed alt-right into existence, and it's now almost a household name.
The humor was a mask. Because as Chris puts it, the history of white supremacy in America is marked by periods where its most ardent practitioners wore masks and periods where they didn't need to.
The beginning of the Klan, of course, they're wearing these grotesque costumes and hoods. The initial Klan wasn't always the white hood we've come to know it. They still felt the need to hide their faces. And then, of course, when Reconstruction is abandoned in the early 1870s, the Klan doesn't need their hoods anymore. They kind of trade in the anonymity of the hood for the anonymity of the lynch mob. And a similar thing happens again during the rise of the Second Klan in the 1920s. And by the way, this is something I didn't know about, but in Atlanta, there was a whole factory devoted to mass producing Klan robes and hoods. I feel like people don't always appreciate just how large the Klan was in the 1920s. It was everywhere. It was getting into government. And then, of course, the Klan, once again, is dissolved and defeated, and it's largely a pyramid scheme that kind of destroys itself. And of course, it's also subject to a healthy opposition, which also leads to its decline.
But as the Klan fell, Chris says institutionalized racism flourished. In 1924, the federal government passed the Reed-Johnson Act that blocked immigration from Asia and put strict quotas on immigration from Eastern or Southern Europe.
And this immigration quota isn't repealed until the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s. And I do think it's interesting, if you look at a lot of the kind of thought leaders or whatever of the MAGA movement, they're so upset about the repeal of that immigration quota.
Today, the mask is off, even if some of the jokes are still around, like the Nazi salutes that caught on after Elon Musk appeared to use one on Inauguration Day.
I did not see it coming. It's classic. People will grovel anything down.
And the people who were hiding before, now they have real influence.
People in the White House listen to them. One of my big concerns is that you're going to see the Trump White House start to take cues from far-right influencers and different far-right groups who are going to paint targets, and then the government will go after those targets. And I think Khalil was the big first example of that.
Over the past few years, Chris and the anti-fascist activists he knows have been watching this rise in power on the ground. Does catching a fascist still work as a tactic if it's like socially and politically fine to be a fascist?
Well, you just literally gave away my whole book. What happens when that taboo disappears? A large part of the work I did was exposing white supremacist soldiers and cops and teachers and politicians. And in a lot of those cases, those people would get fired. They would be shamed by their communities. But there were also stories where communities collectively shrugged their shoulders.
Chris remembers one example specifically. He exposed about a dozen members of the military who were connected to a white supremacist group called Identity Europa.
The military had a really dragged-out response to investigating them after my story. And I think of those dozen, maybe half were kicked out of the military.
You mentioned the military, and I was so struck through Pete Hegseth's confirmation process that a lot of the national conversation seemed to be that he was, that he had this history of drinking and all sorts of other awful personal things. But we didn't really talk all that much about the fact that he's a Christian nationalist, and the tattoos were kind of a blip in the national conversation. I was a little surprised that we didn't go further down that rabbit hole. And I don't know if that also struck you.
Yeah, no, it definitely struck me. And I think what it says is how short news cycles are now.
Yeah.
10 years ago, 20 years ago, maybe, if you had someone as extreme as Pete Hegseth coming in to be in charge of the most powerful military in the world, it would be a daily story. But there's just so much going on that it gets lost. And I think, another part of this too is the media in so many ways is being decimated. I just took a voluntary buyout or a voluntary layoff at HuffPost. About 40 of my colleagues were also laid off. And that's happening across digital media. I mean, it's so interesting to look back at Charlottesville. That's where this conversation started. The outlets, in my opinion, that covered Charlottesville the best were all these new digital media outlets. It was HuffPost, it was Vice, it was Daily Beast. Vice is gone, and then, Daily Beast and HuffPost have had really severe layoffs. And we're seeing not encouraging signs at the Washington Post and the LA Times, I think, about how they're meeting this moment. So to go back to Hegseth in particular, yeah, that should have been a constant scandal. And just as so many of the other people appointed into this administration should have been a constant scandal. I was literally writing the last chapter on the day of Trump's inauguration when Musk threw up the Sieg Heil.
Which left us kind of confused, because so much of the rhetoric around why Mahmoud Khalil is being deported is part of a federal promise to target anti-Semitism across universities. But Trump has built a lot of his support and power from nationalist movements rife with anti-Semitism.
We're talking about a president who has handed the keys of the government to a car salesman who's nostalgic for apartheid South Africa and does Hitler salutes on television. This is the party whose xenophobic rhetoric got 11 people killed at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh.
In Joe's view, Trump's administration talks a big game about anti-Semitism, but its actions speak louder than its words.
These are not people who care about Jews or Jewish safety. They only care about Jewish pain and fear as a lever and a pretext to do this other thing that they really want to do, which is disassemble higher education in this country. It is a deeply cynical and profoundly depressing attempt to, under cover of combating the very real problem of prejudice against Jews, to try to suppress political speech.
As of our publication, Colombia has agreed to meet several demands from the federal government, like a new boss for Middle Eastern studies and new rules on masks. Trump has cut $400 million in federal funding from Colombia until his demands are met. But some of the demands, Joe says, just don't make much sense.
Hours before this letter leaked, the University Judicial Board, which is an independent body that settles disciplinary cases here, handed down disciplinary rulings against people who were alleged participants in the occupation of Hamilton Hall. That's actually the building that I'm sitting in right now. It's my office building.
The punishments for these protesters included multi-year suspensions and expulsions.
If you look at this letter, the first bullet point demands multi-year expulsions and suspensions, and the second bullet point calls for the dissolution of the University Judicial Board, which is the body that just handed down those punishments. So, what do you want? And in some ways, this is a microcosm of this larger incoherence, where it's like, do you hate DEI, or do you want DEI offices to have a lot of resources so they can crush what you call anti-Semitism? But it's also just a sign that the people writing these demands aren't paying attention, don't understand how the university works. It's obviously very grave in its implications, but it's also profoundly unserious as policy. It's just coming out of nonsense and paranoia.
We should jump in here, because it's not all paranoia. Inkstick took a look at some of the social media and public actions by some of the factions at the protests, and honestly, some of it is very troubling. Like when student groups called the October 7th attack by Hamas anti-imperialist and strategic. Actually, the attack targeted civilians, killing more than a dozen children under 10. And it left one of Israel's prominent peace activists dead, not to mention sparking 2 years of brutality on Gazan civilians.
Occasionally, you've seen someone who's, held up a sign that is using an anti-Jewish imagery, or you've seen a video of a chant of someone yelling, "Go back to Poland."
We asked Ben Lorber about this. He's been tracking anti-Semitism in its many forms with the progressive think tank Political Research Associates.
But by and large, I think those are a minority of the protests, and we often are working in a media environment that's often hypersaturated in focusing on these few instances of anti-Semitism and blowing them up, to the point where they're dominating headlines and they're justifying these crackdowns on free speech and civil liberties.
And we don't hear quite so much about some of the Christian nationalist counter-protests at these rallies. Whether those protests are anti-Semitic is up to interpretation, but it is fair to say that they instrumentalize Jewish pain for Christian goals.
In some cases, they scaled the fences at Columbia and they shouted anti-Muslim slurs. But some of the leaders of these protests outside of campuses, waving Israeli flags, they support Israel because of their Christian Zionist end times fantasy, where they think that if they support Israel, that will help to bring the return of Jesus. They support Israel because of a cataclysmic end times scenario. And the Trump administration is full of Christian Zionists who are steering policy.
There's really no such thing as a Palestinian. That's been a political tool to try to force land away from Israel.
Trump is holding together a very big tent. Its internal politics on this get super messy and complicated. You have the factions supporting Trump that are embracing this as a win for their policy goals.
The Heritage Foundation, who put out Project 2025, they came out with a plan called Project Esther to crack down on student protests using lawfare, using arrests, using intimidation.
The far-right pro-Israel group Beitar, that the Anti-Defamation League has called a hate group, has also taken credit for Mahmoud's deportation and says that it handed Trump a list of other people to deport. And Chris pointed out how some MAGA figures are celebrating that Trump is using ICE to kick people out.
There's this MAGA dude named Will Chamberlain who's kind of a big, influencer or whatever. Mehdi Hasan, the former MSNBC host, had posted a lot about Khalil and how concerning it is. And Will Chamberlain called for Mehdi Hasan to be denaturalized and deported.
Ben says that this fits into many MAGA influencers' worldviews.
their broader agenda of attacking DEI or attacking, wokeness or, their broader anti-immigrant and anti-Muslim agenda. Many in the MAGA camp see defense of Israel as defense of what they call Western civilization. And so they're willing to ally with, say, the 20% of American Jews who do support Trump, and they're willing to scapegoat the many American Jews who ourselves are part of the movements for ceasefire in Gaza.
You also see this wave of anti-Semitism that, with all of the attention on stuff like campus protests, often gets overlooked.
We often hear from folks like Trump that the left is full of anti-Israel, anti-Semites. But the ironic thing is that most people on the left are not driven by anti-Semitism. They're driven by support for human rights primarily. That's on the right where you actually see more of this anti-Israel, anti-Semitism. Nick Fuentes, who's a minority in the MAGA camp, but he's a vocal minority.
He's also turned on Trump recently, but that's very new.
He's very much against U.S. support for Israel, but it's not because he has real concern for Palestinians. He sees it all through the lens of the Jewish conspiracy. You also have folks like Tucker Carlson, who's a very prominent MAGA influencer, or Candace Owens.
As Americans on both sides of the aisle question the U.S.'s military support to Israel, Ben sees right-wing media trying to pull people's dissatisfaction away from a human rights frame in a more conspiratorial and anti-Semitic direction.
Some of the podcasters who supported Trump, like Joe Rogan or Theo Von, in the kind of manosphere realm, they're increasingly open to these kinds of conspiracy theories that, Israel was behind the JFK assassination or the U.S. is being occupied by a Zionist cabal.
And sometimes you'll even hear Trump fans who support Israel using anti-Semitism and nationalism to get their point across.
They're spreading conspiracy theories, for example, that George Soros is behind the very student protests they're saying is anti-Semitic. They're using these anti-Semitic conspiracy theories that make Jews less safe.
Dalia Shamas is a lawyer with the Center for Constitutional Rights. She says that the right is ignoring these voices in its own house.
An equation of speech on campuses, advocacy to, end a genocide, which is how these students and activists articulate their goals, to end U.S. endless wars, endless support for the Israeli military, right, to paint all of that as somehow anti-Semitic and completely ignoring that some of the loudest activists are actually Jewish themselves, while also ignoring actual anti-Semitism on the right is really troubling.
Dalia is actually working on Mahmoud Khalil's case right now, and she says that anyone else who stands in the way of U.S. foreign policy goals could be next.
We know that once we hand over these tools to the government, once we turn the other way, they're going to be using them against anybody who's protesting. That's how state expansion happens.
But why is Trump starting with Palestinian activism? That's after the break. Here's the thing. Beyond the stump speeches and Truth Social posts, it's actually kind of hard to figure out what the U.S. government thinks Mahmoud Khalil did. His first notice to appear didn't provide details. The New York Times says that he was manning the bullhorn during a protest where pro-Hamas flyers were handed out. And we know that Colombia accused him of organizing a protest on the anniversary of October 7th, where positive things were said about the Hamas attack. They also say that he led a group that had pro-Hamas posts on their social media. But those accusations never actually turned into an investigation, so we can't really know for sure. Recently, the Department of Homeland Security added that he'd neglected to note his work for the British Embassy, his membership with Columbia University Apartheid Divest, or his role as a political officer for UNRWA on his green card application. And an independent civil suit against Khalil and others of campus groups says that they spread protest and propaganda materials while the October 7th attack was ongoing, and it accuses them of knowing about the attack in advance. But we don't know if that's true either. In his first statement after the arrest, Khalil said that he was unlawfully arrested and detained, and that his arrest was a direct consequence of exercising his right to free speech. Dalia Shamas spoke to us about Mahmoud just before that letter was released.
He's extremely worried about his wife, primarily Noor, who's 8 months pregnant. They're expecting their first child next month. They were expecting to spend this last month, it's Ramadan, together, really preparing for this new child, washing everything, getting everything ready in their apartment.
Yeah.
And now their lives have been turned upside down, and there really is a lot of uncertainty. But he's trying his best to keep his spirits high.
Yeah. Have you connected with his wife as well? How is she doing?
Yes, I've connected with Noor, who's being incredibly strong and is also understandably really just distressed, worried about Mahmoud, worried about their future. There are so many unknowns right now.
The video of ICE whisking Mahmoud away from his Morningside Heights apartment and threatening to take Noor as well has been posted by the ACLU.
Turn around, turn around, turn around, turn around.
And now has millions of views.
Okay, he's not resisting. He's giving me his phone, okay? He's not.
A moment of extreme crisis is now a matter of public news, national attention. It's been a lot for her.
Especially at 8 months pregnant. Having personally been there 3 times, I can't, at this particular point in the process, especially imagine. And maybe it shouldn't surprise us that it was ICE that showed up that night. Using the immigration system gives the federal government 2 particular advantages. One of them is the chance to move someone around and try to get their case heard in a less friendly jurisdiction.
That does absolutely seem to be part of the intention here. It also makes them harder to find. It makes it hard for the lawyers to find them, to file the emergency kinds of motions that we were filing in this case, and gets us embroiled in this jurisdictional and venue battle.
The other thing is that the immigration system doesn't have the same due process rights that we're entitled to in the criminal system.
The immigration system is the lowest hanging fruit. You don't have the kinds of protections, due process protections in the immigration system that you can invoke in the criminal system. And there still are protections. The First Amendment applies to everybody regardless of your status. But it is not a surprise that the sort of first opening shot in this really what's going to be a much bigger push to try to really gut the Palestinian rights movement in the U.S. is through the lens of the immigration system.
Dalia told us that Trump's actions are far from the first time that activism in support of Palestinians has been used to crack down on dissent. And maybe that makes sense, because that advocacy has historically been not super popular in this country. A Gallup poll on what they describe as the Middle East situation since 2001 consistently showed that a small majority of Americans sympathized more with Israelis, although that number dipped to 46% this year. Just 16% of Americans supported Palestinians more in 2001. And that number is now 33%, but lots of people are still ambivalent or don't know. And that might be in part because in the U.S., we have this long history of associating Palestinians with terrorism.
The very first time that the word terrorism shows up in the U.S. Federal Register is in 1969, and in the context of limiting, in the Foreign Assistance Act, and it's in the context of limiting or conditioning U.S. support for Palestinian refugees through the United Nations agency, which is also named UNRWA.
The law said that UNRWA needed to make sure that its aid in refugee camps wasn't going to anyone training to join terrorist groups. The Center for Constitutional Rights, though, argues that this whole thing depended on and even furthered the concept of the Palestinian refugee as a terrorist until proven otherwise.
There was a move away from communism as being the terrible, horrible thing that is out there in the world that we're mobilizing to this notion of the terrorist as an organizing principle.
Dalia says that this pattern of introducing words or ideas about new security threats to America that need to be averted, it's repeated itself over and over again, with Palestinians as the big bad.
Whether you look at immigration law, whether you look at the sanctions regime, whether you look at criminal law, material support to terrorism laws, at key junctures when those laws were expanded or initially passed in the first place, Palestine played very prominently, or specifically the desire to kind of silence or shrink the space for advocacy for Palestinians played a prominent role.
For example, after the Oklahoma City bombings by domestic white supremacists in 1995, the only anti-terrorism laws that were passed targeted foreign groups, many of them Palestinian. Dalia says once again, deporting Mahmoud Khalil is a test case for what the U.S. presidency can get away with.
President Trump has said that this is the first of many to come.
We are going to move forward with more arrests, as President Trump previewed in his statement yesterday.
And we believe him.
If you think that Dalia is being hyperbolic here, just look at the breadth of people rounded up by ICE in recent weeks. A Turkish graduate student who wrote an op-ed about Gaza, a Canadian actor updating her visa paperwork at the border, and scores of Venezuelans accused of being criminals because they had tattoos. And while this particular crackdown is starting with immigration, we've also seen the Trump administration move to criminalize Habitat for Humanity for accepting funds from the Environmental Protection Agency and attempt to shutter Voice of America, which began as a literal effort to counter Nazi propaganda for being, quote, anti-Trump. Chris worries that some of his anti-fascist sources could be next.
There's already reports and indications of this, that they are going to dial back their investigations of right-wing groups and intensify their investigations of left-wing groups. And then, obviously, I think as well, you're going to see... Do you remember that moment during the presidential debate in the lead up to the 2020 election when Trump told the Proud Boys to stand back and stand by? You know, what he was doing there was like signaling to the Proud Boys, like, I am with you, I will deploy you when I need you. That kind of relationship between far-right vigilantes and people in power is something I think we really have to keep an eye on.
Chris says that it's only a matter of time before those people come head-to-head with the leftists that he's in contact with. And Palestinian activism, it may well be what brings them out to the streets.
The extreme measures the Trump administration is taking right now, which I would argue are fascist, historically that always invites some kind of militant anti-fascist response. This will end up in the streets at some point. It's starting to get warm again, so typically that's when it happens. When that does happen, what I am worried about is the GOP and Trump and Musk deploying far-right vigilantes against people in the streets. I think another battle line that's going to be drawn as well is the relationship between National Guard and state governors. So if Trump wants to deploy the National Guard to quell a protest, will a Democratic governor allow that? And a Republican governor, from what we can tell, will obviously allow that. And what does that look like? So I think there's a lot of avenues right now for this to play out. It's going to be another long, hot summer.
Things That Go Boom is distributed by Inkstick Media and PRX. This episode was produced by Katie Toth with a little help from me. Our music is composed by Darian Schulman, and Robin Wise makes our show always sound its very best. Thank you to our supporters, the Carnegie Corporation of New York and Plowshares Fund, as well as the Cologne Foundation, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Prospect Hill Foundation, and the Jubitz Family Foundation. This is our last official episode of the season, but you can expect us to pop back in periodically as always, and we'll also be back with a whole new season this summer. In the meantime, you can visit us at Inkstick Media on all of your favorite social media channels. And if you feel so inclined, it is a tough time for the news, and we only expect it to get tougher. If you're able, please consider a donation at inkstickmedia.com/donate. That's inkstickmedia.com/donate. Thank you so much for listening and for your support in all of its forms. We're really grateful. We'll see you soon.
I earnestly believe all these fascists are bound to lose. And I do think there's a silver lining from my perspective, and I think we saw this over the last 8 years as well, is that people are probably waking up and being radicalized to how their institutions might not protect them, and that they are going to have to work together. They're going to have to do mutual aid. They're going to have to come together and maybe embrace more radical solutions to fight this. So this is an incredibly scary moment, but you have to keep the faith, I think.
Bound to lose, you fascists bound to lose.
From PRX.